those of you who don't know me, I'm Medenwaldt. I am here. I finished seminary last year and decided to come here and keep doing school. So I'm doing a PhD in psychology. And so just to say, Alex, your talk was great. Where'd you go? And definitely, that's good psychology right there, right? Where we have reason and emotion, and we're whole body beings, and we need to appeal to both. And as apologists, we tend to be more on the rational side and forget that there's other people who aren't exactly the same as us. So very well done, and thank you. And so hopefully my talk does a little bit of appealing to some of that emotion, and is a little fun, and talk about the birds and the bees today, and do it from the perspective of science.
Is that bumblebee in a trench coat specifically?
A lab coat.
Oh,
actually, yeah. So science. We're talking about the science of sex. So that's what I was going for.
Why are there birds and bees on them?
We can have that talk later.
Robots.
All right. So one of the things. So I just want to give a very brief intro. I didn't grow up as a Christian, and so my reasons for either having sex or not having sex grow up had nothing to do with religious belief. It was all whether or not I might get someone pregnant and how that might affect my hockey career. Needless to say, that wasn't quite enough of motivation to keep me from any sort of sexual activity. And so I did have premarital sex and other sexual relations before being married. And I just bring that up to tell you, hopefully, that this is both maybe extra reasons for you if you have trouble following the biblical model, but can also, to some extent, be used as an apologetic. But on the other hand, if whatever your past is, this isn't something that should shame you or cause, hopefully, any issues or struggles, because it is something that, as we talk, it can be overcome, and it just may or may not take some extra work depending on your background and different factors. So it's not like an absolute, this is necessarily everyone. It's aggregate kind of data. Clear enough? Okay, so first, the activity's already started. That's the Band-Aid on your hand. We'll talk about that in a second here. Briefly talk about the biblical view and some hypotheses from that, which probably shouldn't take a lot of work. Knowing this crowd, I think we'll have an idea of that. And then we'll talk about some of the science, social, biological science of sex, and then we'll lead into questions. And you can ask questions at any point. Feel free to put up your hand and stop and have a conversation. I'm completely okay with that, especially if something's unclear, you want to go a little deeper. So the Bible and sex, what does the Bible say? Some people, maybe not know, but I know a lot of people often have a wrong view of sex from the Bible. But the first thing I think that the Bible does say is sex is good. It's a gift from God. It's something given to us to use and enjoy. And a lot of people are often given that mindset or raised in a way that, wait, don't have sex. Maybe even that causes people to think that sex is bad or God doesn't like sex, but he does. He created it. He gave it to us. He gave it to us as a gift. We have the Song of Solomon, right? The whole book of the Bible that talks about sex. And some people might debate this, but think of that. So my daughter, actually, one day I tell them before they use their tablets, if you want to use your tablet, you have to read a chapter from the Bible. So she played some Bible roulette, opened the Bible up and read a passage. I asked her later, what'd you read? She said, I don't know, it was kind of weird. And she showed me, she read from the Song of Solomon. Yeah, let's just stick with the book and work through it. Thankfully, it was my older daughter, but yeah. The Bible says sex is good. 1 Corinthians 7:13, it tells married couples to fulfill each other's sexual needs, right? Proverbs 5:18 through 19, rejoice with your wife, and that's kind of a euphemism. It's not just saying, yay, celebrate, right? It's more than that. Let her breasts fill you with delight. And so the Bible does talk about sex in a positive way. Be fruitful and multiply. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. And so sex is a good thing. And so that should always be kind of our mindset when we think about sex personally, or we're talking about it with other people, whatever the context may be. Sex is a good gift from God. However, right? Because there's always a but. Well, not always, but usually there's a but, okay? All good things can be used in wrong. So food, money, alcohol, knowledge, those are all good things, right? But they can be used the wrong way. The Bible says not money is the root of all evil, but the love of money is the root of all evil. So having too much of it, or eating too much or the wrong kind, right? can be bad. The Bible talks about drunkenness versus alcohol. Jesus turned water into wine to celebrate and have fun, but the Bible over and over talks about the woes and warnings of drunkenness and not to do it. And same with knowledge. Knowledge throughout the Bible almost universally said is good and beneficial and strive for knowledge. But too much knowledge or used the wrong way, it can make you arrogant and can have downsides too, or it can take you away from perhaps sharing that knowledge with other people. So all good things used inappropriately can become bad. And so sex, don't think of sex as some separate different thing like that's necessarily more dangerous or worse, but it fits in this category with several other things. It's good, but can be used the wrong way. All right, so that's the biblical view. So now the question, the hypothesis, let's draw some hypotheses from that. What do you think? Let me ask you. What do you think that should tell us about people who follow the biblical model for sex versus those who don't? Or what? Let's back that up a second. The Bible has guidelines for how we should engage in sex. Let me ask you why. I think there's two broad hypotheses we could come up with. Luke?
I guess the love of sex would be bankrupt, just like the love of other things is bankrupt.
Okay.
So if you're chasing after something simply for itself, it's not going to be fulfilling.
Okay, good. Yeah, you're on the right track. Let me hold that for the second one. But the first one, if you're a skeptic and you're looking at the Bible, why do you think the Bible has certain commands about sex?
We are less likely to get STDs.
So that could be it, but okay, so yeah, possibly for those reasons, yeah. I'm going to say from like a complete skeptic point of view, not giving the Bible any credit for anything at all, what might someone say?
It's just a product of its time.
Right.
So its sexual mores are old-fashioned.
Okay, good. So essentially we have these two hypotheses. The Bible is an old, stupid book. It was mores of a time. Maybe there was some benefit for STDs back then because they didn't know better. You could also maybe say it's just a tool to control people. Right? So that's going to be probably your non-Christian perspective, or something that at least we want to put up for the test. So there's going to be little to no benefit in modern day for following the biblical guidelines. It's basically that first hypothesis. The second one, the Christian hypothesis, I think is going to be more than what Luke was getting on. Right? If we follow this model, it's going to be for our own good. Not doing it will lead to negative consequences. And so we put this in a scientific context and we test it scientifically. Well, the scientists have actually done this in many different ways, and so we put that up. But first, we have to know what we're talking about. So, I'm going to change this. Different sex options. So, how are the different ways we can have sex? All right, and hopefully you feel a little uncomfortable here. I'm not talking about positions or anything, but what are the different possibilities? So, for instance, monogamy. What else in that category of types of things?
So like polygyny and polyandry, so the two kinds of polygamy where
Right.
it's either male and many females or female and many males.
Right, okay, what else? That's it, either polygamy or monogamy?
Or not at all.
Not at all? Okay, that would be one I didn't put it up there.
Sex.
Like polyamorous.
Polyamorous, okay. So put several of these things that say maybe evolution created us, or God designed us or whatever to experiment and learn what we like and don't like, and then maybe do that forever, or then end up in relationships. That would be an option. Maybe we were meant to just be promiscuous through our whole life, like bunnies or something. Okay, maybe that's how human beings are supposed to be, based on our nature. Polygamy, as we mentioned. Serial monogamy. We're supposed to be in committed long-term relationships, but those aren't supposed to be forever. So we can go from one long-term relationship to another, and so on. Or monogamy. Right? So these are the different options. Broadly speaking, we could probably get more, but essentially these are the different things we need to test and say which one is going to be the best one based on the data, or what seems to make the most sense. So, the science of sex. To start, let's first see and talk about some actual statistics about broadly your age group. I've tailored this back and forth for different age groups, younger and older. So But I think everything here is for, people high school or recent graduates of high school to college level, all right? So some of this might be a little surprising to some of you, but about 75% of people say, young people, there's too much pressure to have sex. I don't know if you agree with that or not, or feel that yourself, but in our culture where we constantly see people acting sexualized or hear them talking about it, it seems kind of the opposite, where people feel like, well, if I'm not doing it or doing it enough, something's wrong with me. But that's actually, most people feel there's too much pressure for it. 70% of people say they need more information for sex, okay? When you think about it, again, we see it everywhere in our culture. We think we know everything about it, but when people answer private anonymous surveys, they say they want more information. 70% of people think their peers are having more sex than them. Think about that for a second. Should only be 50%, right? If we divide everyone, right? So more people than not think others are having more sex than them. And we'll explain a little bit of this reasoning in a little bit. And then the last one, I think it's the last one. No, one more after that. So this is newer data, but almost 60% of people graduate high school and still as a virgin. So more than 50% now, and it's changed. Actually, when I was in high school, it was much lower. So there has been at least improvement in society in some regard in that way. And then 25 to 45% are still virgin in college, and this comes from a range of both between the time they start and end college and also different surveys. So broadly speaking, that number goes down, but it's still probably higher than most people think. And you have this feeling that everyone's having sex and there's no virgins, but that's not necessarily the case. At least 25%, if not more, by the time they finish college are still virgins. So why does it seem like so many more people are having sex? So some of these biases that plague us, and this doesn't just affect our views in sex, this is kind of any of our decision making. Does anyone have any guesses before I show some up here? Does anyone remember their psychological biases from their intro psych course? I'll give you a hint on this first one. Information that's more available to your mind is more likely to affect your decision. Does that cue you in? Anything? Nothing?
Selection?
Close.
Confirmation bias.
So it kind of works close with like a confirmation bias, but the specific one I'm talking about is availability heuristic. Information that's available, right? What's present, what we see and hear most often, or is more in line with our personality, right? That influences our decisions more. So when we hear about sex more often, right, that's available to us, and so we automatically think it's more prevalent than it really is, or it stands out because you're talking about boredom, right? Sex isn't boring. Even if we've never had sex, we know it's not going to be boring, right? So it sticks out to our mind and is more prevalent. And so that's one kind of bias that makes us think that it's happening more than it really is. 2, the false consensus effect. This is when, and it's really bad in like junior high and high school, and we've all been there before and know it, but this idea that we think something's going on and everyone's doing it, right? So in this case, we hear about people talking about sex, or we see sex and we think, oh, well, everyone must be doing it. I'm the only one not doing it. It might have been the case at some point with maybe people wearing a certain shoe or maybe getting piercings. We think it's way more prevalent than it really is. And we especially feel that if we view ourselves on the outside. So, oh, I don't have a tattoo. Everyone's getting tattoos. I should get a tattoo to be like everyone else. And he's like, oh, well, actually, it's really only about 50%, although I'm not quite sure on the numbers. I think it's right around there. But that's kind of a broad thing with anything. And then the last one is the spotlight effect. We, as humans, again, we feel there's a lot bigger spotlight on us than there are other people. And so you ever wake up in the morning and have a zit on your nose? Like, oh no, I can't go to school today, right? Everyone's gonna notice. And then your parents make you go to school anyway and no one says anything and nobody probably even notices, right? That's our natural human tendency to feel like people are watching us a lot closer than they really are. Again, so this doesn't just apply to sex. This is kind of a broad global thing. There's actually an interesting study they did on this where it was back in the 90s. So what was embarrassing is a little different. But they asked a bunch of students, what's the single most embarrassing, I want to say person or band they could wear on a t-shirt? And the answer was Barry Manilow. So they made a bunch of these Barry Manilow shirts, and they gave them to students and had them go to class. And these students, super embarrassed and thought everyone was going to notice, only a small percentage of people actually noticed that the person was wearing a Barry Manilow shirt. But yet these people were like, oh no, this is going to be awful. People are going to notice. All right? So people aren't paying that close of attention to us, which is actually really kind of a good thing if we think about it. They're paying more attention to what we say and how we act and our direct interactions with us. They're not necessarily paying attention to us all the time across the lunchroom or the clothes we wear or these kind of smaller things. Okay, so moving on then. So that's kind of the social side of it and how our perceptions are shaped by kind of society about what we think about sex. But now let's move into the biology of sex. All right, so this is very kind of simplified, but some scientists have proposed that there's kind of these three different systems, sexual systems, kind of in our brain or body, so to speak. And again, kind of a rough outline. The one is the sexual motivation system, which is largely driven by testosterone and estrogen. This is kind of our sexual desire and responses and attractiveness, things like that. The second one is the romantic attraction system. So we get dopamine and norepinephrine going off in our brain and making us feel good. Oftentimes when we first engage in relationships, this gets really high, and so some people, psychologists, will call this like the infatuation stage, which can last up to 2 years. Right? We get in these relationships and it's like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest person ever. I want to spend all the time with them and I love them so much. No, I'm going to die if anything happens to them, right? And we can sometimes smother them if that's mismatched between the two people. But if both people are high in that, right, we look from the outside and we're like, oh, that's sickening, right? So that's kind of what's going on. It's basically seeing that person, being with that person is causing dopamine to get released in the reward center of their brain and making them feel good. And so they're doing it more and more and more and want to keep doing it. And it's the same. It's very similar to, say, taking drugs or eating chocolate or junk food or things like that. It's the same, very similar kind of thing going on. And the last one is kind of the long-term attachment system, which is from mostly associated with oxytocin and vasopressin. And so often this again happens when we bond and we spend time together, but sex kind of changes everything. So you think in terms of these three systems, right? They can all somewhat exist independently of each other. Sex essentially brings them all together and binds them closely together. So it kind of creates this much stronger bond and commitment. Right? It makes sense. The Bible says that two shall become one. It talks about sleeping with prostitutes and becoming one with them. That's what's going on. So that's kind of the basic biology, just broadly speaking, of sex and how it affects our brains. So what are the effects of that? So before we get into that, now take your Band-Aid, take it off. You can rip it or go fast. It's fast or slow. It's interesting. There's other actual psych research on the effects of pain and experiencing pain. And generally speaking, lesser pain over a long period of time is viewed more positively as sharp pain for a short period of time. So the whole rip it and get it done with is actually usually more negative. So if you have a kid one day and you don't want them to be scared of Band-Aids, it's probably to pull their Band-Aids off slow rather than just ripping them. But that's a side of it. So yeah. I love getting into little things which people don't know science is actually studied. Okay? So now I want you to take that Band-Aid and put it back on your skin somewhere. Doesn't matter where. All right, and pull it off again. The second time you pulled it off, was it easier or harder?
It's easier.
A lot easier. It doesn't hurt as bad, right? Okay, so now I want that to kind of be just a rough model in your head of what happens when we have sex. Because when we have sex with someone And this includes, say, fantasizing about them or watching pornography, because our brain doesn't really know the difference. It's all real. And there's maybe different levels of response in the brain, but it's still essentially the same things happening in the brain. We bond with people. So that's the vasopressin and oxytocin, causes a bond. And so when that happens, and we have sex, and it creates that bond, and we do it again, and it creates a bond, and keeps strengthening that bond, but then we break up, we move on, we go to a different partner, then that bond becomes weaker. We essentially desensitize ourselves to that vasopressin and oxytocin, because those hormones, they get released, they bond us to a partner, but then if we're bonding to more people, right, it's like we lose that stickiness. So those hormones don't become as powerful every time that we're moving to a new partner, okay? Does that make sense? So that's kind of the purpose of having those Band-Aids. The other thing which goes along with bonding, so if you're more bonded with a person, you're going to have greater commitment to them. Okay, again, these sound like good things, and they are, and they're meant to be good things, okay? And we'll talk about more on that in a second, but generally speaking, this is good. With our partners, the people we marry and have relationships into, we want to have a close bond and be committed. That's the point of a committed relationship, is to be committed, right, amongst other things. All right, and the last thing that this does, which people often don't think or realize how really powerful it is, it creates expectations. So again, whether this is through pornography or experiences of another person or whatever it might be, we have these different views or broad views, and we create expectations in our mind. And this is regardless of either appearance of our partner, or maybe the things that they're interested in doing, or what their body might be physically able to do, because parts, and internal and external, they have some small variations. And so some things just don't work depending on the two different people, whether it's a height thing or internal, like whatever, right? And so we have more partners, we view more pornography or whatever, we create certain expectations. And you say, oh, wait, well, no big deal. How many of us have ever been angry?
Angry? Yeah.
Angry. Anyone? What made you angry?
Smallest thing.
Smallest thing like what?
Some people forget to move the laundry from the laundry room to the bedroom.
Okay, why does that bother you?
Because it's small, it's not the best, most efficient way.
All right, but why should they have to do it that way?
I'm right.
Right. So we expect one thing to happen and it doesn't happen. We get caught in traffic. Oh no, we get mad because we were expecting to go where we were going in the time, and oh, it was an accident. So some psychologists argue basically any kind of anger stems from, we have an expectation, that expectation is not met, which leads to frustration, which leads to anger. And so now imagine your whole adult life, or most of your adult life, being filled or having a disappointment of those expectations. Again, not to say this is necessarily going to happen, but it's very high likelihood, or is something that could happen, and maybe it doesn't. But that's one of those things that people don't often think about when we indiscriminately go and just view pornography or have as many partners as we decide we want. Okay? So, obvious reasons, we kind of touched on it. The biblical model for sex: wait until your marriage. Wait until you're in a monogamous, married, committed relationship to have sex. That's kind of the biblical model. Okay? And so there are obvious reasons. We'll get to that, but Luke has a question first.
Yeah, so it was kind of on the other point. Do you think that the purity movement of like the 80s and 90s on the part of Christian culture has somewhat distorted expectations for sex?
I know there's been a lot of talk about that recently. I say it's hard to say. I think in some cases there's certainly, I think, a lot of distortion in views of sex towards people saying, kind of always only talking about it negatively, right? You see, this thing is good, but we're only going to talk about the negative, so you don't do it until you're married. That affects people, so they have a bad view of sex. But I think also there may have been, and I don't know if it was due to that purity movement or maybe it was just general cultural things or something else going on, but idea that like if you wait everything will be perfect.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the case either, because even if you wait, your spouse waits, and you never have sex until the night of your wedding, right? There still might be issues. You still might have either some emotional struggles or difficulty connecting or some embarrassment about being naked, or you might have physical pain. There's some people who just, usually it's more women, but there are men too, sometimes that having sex causes them physical pain. And so there certainly can be issues even if you do everything right. And there are occasional people who can maybe do everything wrong who might still have good experiences. I mean, there's always going to be outliers and things that happen. And so that's actually, thank you for that question, because that's an easy thing to think about is, we're not guaranteeing something's going to be perfect. And even amongst living the Christian life, what are we promised as Christians? Are we to suffer, right? It's easy to avoid that as Americans, but we're not promised a happy, healthy, long life as Christians. We're promised the perfect eternal life. We might not get that until we die, right? Maybe we get it here, maybe we see aspects of it here, but we're not promised that. We're not promised good mental health. We're not promised good physical health. We're not promised perfect relationships. We're not promised all these different things. And so we can certainly do things to help that. Right? We avoid debt is a general good principle that's probably going to free you up to do a lot of better things in your life, okay? But it doesn't promise that you might not lose your health care because your employer switched systems and they didn't tell you or properly inform you, and then that same month you find out that you got cancer and now you have $500,000 in medical bills and have to file bankruptcy. Like, those things happen. But generally speaking, like, following that biblical model will help set you up for success. So yeah, long answer. Thank you for that question. So going back to the biblical model of sex and why we do it. So you kind of mentioned it already. We know the obvious, right? We hear about STDs. We probably don't realize how many of them there actually can be and how they can affect us. Some of these are curable, some aren't. Interesting thing, syphilis is curable, but if it goes a long time, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause neurosyphilis, which oddly enough often causes positive symptoms, or people gives them very good, happy mood. And so then they can cure the syphilis, but the neurological effects are still there because it happens through damaging the brain. I wouldn't recommend trying to get syphilis, and so that you can get that, but it's just probably because it also leads to death, right? So it goes untreated long enough, it kills you. So, you're playing with fire there. I wouldn't recommend it. Some other reasons possibly for the biblical model of sex and why even in its culture, if we're not saying it's inspired, why it might have been there. So help to avoid pregnancy in situations where the baby can't be properly cared for. Right? People often will experience regret after having sex with either lots of people or someone that they didn't think they were going to be with in a long time. Some fear and anxiety about having sex or meeting expectations or engaging in relationships. So these are kind of the more obvious reasons. However, what are some of the not so obvious reasons? The ones you probably don't hear talked about in the news or the media or amongst your friends. Does anyone have any guesses based on what we talked about with the bonding and the systems? What do you think the outcomes are? Actual testable outcomes of engaging in sex with multiple partners. Go ahead, do you have a guess?
Well, no, I don't know if I've heard it before, but kind of this emotional, you can't have that long-term connection with people anymore.
Okay.
Kind of like what you talked about earlier, but now.
Right, so you're on the right track. Luke?
Yeah, I feel like jading yourself to like actual intimacy.
Okay. Yeah? Mitchell?
I'll go out on like lower sexual satisfaction.
Okay. Any other guesses before I reveal? All right. So one is depression. So it's hard to show causality from the studies that are out there, but people who are engaged with more sexual partners tend to have higher rates of depression. So it gets kind of the intimacy and emotional part of it. So again, it's not maybe people who are depressed are seeking that, sexual intimacy to help their depression, or maybe it's because they're having all these partners that's causing depression. Likely what we get with kind of these psychological things, it's probably a little bit of both, okay? Self-esteem. So again, we often see people low self-esteem seeking that, but it's probably likely that people who are engaged in a lot of those relationships have lower self-esteem, because ultimately you often find, and this is usually more of an issue for women, unfortunately, it's just a hard world for you, all women, getting used for simply one aspect of your being, right? We're whole body beings, we're emotional, rational, physical, spiritual, like we're these whole body things, and to be used only for one aspect of that with no care for the rest of you, that can have negative effects on your self-esteem and can really be emotionally challenging for people. Interesting one is divorce rate is actually higher the more partners people have had before getting married, which a lot of people, you've probably heard marriage or having sex compared to like buying a car, right? You want to drive it and test drive it, which is kind of a crude analogy, but we hear it a lot, right? So this idea that you want to drive it first, you want to know if it works. I'm going to let you in on a secret. Your parts together are going to work. Again, and really, if you are in a long-term committed relationship with someone, and if they are one of those people who has a painful experience during sex, is that really something that you want to break off your entire relationship in the next 40 or 50 years of your life over something, that one aspect of them? Most people would say probably not, because there's still, that's not saying when people have those problems or things with sex that they don't ever have sex or can't enjoy sex. It just requires maybe some workarounds or some therapy or some medication. There's lots of different ways to cope with that. So the research is actually pretty clear on that. This idea that, okay, we have to have sex before marriage so we know it's going to work. Well, again, going back to the bonding, why do you think that, what happens? What do you think is happening there?
Would it be like that, the dopamine sensor? Like it's kind of like the same thing with addiction, in the sense that your brain's just starting to turn off and you need a higher, your tolerance level's so high. I mean, that's
right. Yeah, so part of it, right? So you have that one partner and you're bonding strong with them, right? And actually, if you had that one partner end up marrying them, I'm guessing you wouldn't see negative side effects. Although there's some research showing that women in particular, when their partner has had sex before marriage, women are less trusting of that person to be faithful, which kind of makes sense from like an evolutionary psych perspective, where men can much more freely be promiscuous without getting caught. And so that might be a factor, but again, if they've only had sex with them, I don't know if that would be a thing, and it might be more situation specific. Mitchell, did you have something?
No, that was the question I was going to ask is, right. Does any of this relate to specifically as long as you're having sex with the same partner even before marriage?
Right. So interesting. So probably not, and it's actually Scott Stanley, he's a researcher at University of Denver, Christian, has written a couple books. Some of his research has focused on the difference between having premarital sex after engagement, or living together. They kind of put those together because they kind of assume if you're cohabitating, you're having sex, so they don't pull that apart. So those who do that only while engaged versus those who are married. And actually, the people who wait until they're engaged look like the people who waited until they're married, which kind of makes sense, because if you think about it, really when you're getting engaged, you at least theoretically, you should be saying, okay, we're making that commitment of marriage here and now. So you have that hopefully same level of commitment, although people probably don't actually view it that way. But yeah, so it's interesting to see those different groups. And I'd say the other part with the bonding, how many people here would feel comfortable buying a house right now? Why are you shaking your head?
I don't even know where I'm going. Where's the house?
Okay. Right.
No. Commitment. My next step is.
Commitment, that's a big deal. So now let's imagine, right? you're with someone for 2 weeks or even, let's say, 2 months. Do you know if you want to marry that person yet?
Yes.
I mean, some people, yes, but many of you, especially in college or recently after college, do you know if you're ready to give yourself completely to that person yet? But what happens when we're still undecided, we're not sure, and then we have sex? Again, it brings us together and bonds and creates kind of overcommitment. It's like jumping off into the deep end, right? We're only ready to be kind of wading out maybe a foot or so over our head, and then we jump in, and all of a sudden now we have to learn how to swim. And so we get committed. And so a lot of people, what'll happen is they're in relationships and they're having sex, and so then they move in together and they're having sex. And so then, I guess we should talk about marriage, and they do, and then they get married, but then they get past that infatuation period, or just little things have built up, and then the highest divorce rate is actually within the first 5 year of marriage. It's not because they just discovered new things in those first 5 years, but because there's been that build up, they realize, no, things aren't going to get better. Marriage didn't fix it. Having kids didn't fix it. I want out now, right? But now they've already had kids oftentimes. They've created this closer life together, and so they're more likely to get divorced. Did you have a question?
No, you can answer.
Okay. Yeah, and this relates too. So divorce, there's been a lot of ways and techniques to try and make the divorce better for kids. I've heard about parents switching the home. So, typically mom has a home, dad has a home, and the kids go back and forth. Well, there's a new thing I've heard about where the kids stay in the home, right? So they stay in school, same bus route, everything, and the parents split their time living in the home, the mom and dad. I don't know if that's any better for the kids, but still, like, the effects of divorce are really devastating for kids, really at any age, even oftentimes adults. You get to be 18, 19, or even become an adult and the parents get divorced. It really has negative effects on people when that happens. So kind of bad all around for that. The other one, which again is often surprising for people, is sexual fulfillment. I'm guessing everyone here wants to have a fulfilling sex life in their marriage. Right? That's kind of, at least for most people, the end goal, what they strive for in sex. And so they think, try it out with different people, learn different things, have more experience, and I'll have a better sex life in marriage. But the research shows it's the other way around. Waiting until you're married leads to more sexual fulfillment in marriage. Which really, again, if you think about it in terms of bonding, commitment, trust, those types of things, it kind of makes perfect sense, but it's just not the way we often think as a culture. And then, again, so the oxytocin, vasopressin, it relates to kind of all of these differently and why we see some of those effects. At least that's kind of the general theory and what scientists will say as far as what is going on, why we see these things. It's because of mostly those hormones. Mitchell?
I'm familiar with how oxytocin functions. What does vasopressin do?
Both basically do the same thing. Vasopressin actually arguably is the one that's more of the bonding hormone and bonds us closer together. And I forget, I want to say vasopressin. I'm not going to say which one is more dominant in males or females, but women are more likely to get this and bond with friends and things over conversation than men. Men actually more likely to get much more higher doses of the oxytocin and vasopressin through sex alone with their partner. But again, so it's not necessarily bad to have these things flowing through our brains, but if you've all learned about classical conditioning and operant conditioning in your psych classes, like mice and pulling levers, right? We build associations, and so when we get this certain flow of the vasopressin, oxytocin in a context with our partner versus some random person or whatever, we associate things differently. And that's, again, an effect that's not to be taken lightly, because even drug addicts, there's a specificity to where they take the drugs. So if they take a drug in a certain place all the time or similar context, they can actually take higher doses of it than when they're in other places. And that's oftentimes why people will OD. Like, okay, I can take this dosage of this drug, and they take it, but they're in a different setting and their body's not prepared for it. They OD and end up dying from it, simply because they did the same thing they always do in a different setting. So it's not something to be just kind of ignored and pushed aside. All right. So if we come back to our different options, right, based on what we shared and what we talked about, which one turns out to have the best outcomes associated with it? I guess my thing didn't work. Oh, okay. It kind of did work. Biblical model. Again, it's hard to say like exactly because there's some limitations on the research with this, and some things can shift culturally, even if some of it is kind of biologically based. But the evidence we have seems to suggest that out of all these different options, monogamy, the biblical model, is the best one for our mental and physical health. Are there any questions? Yes, Luke.
How do you think pornography has affected this question and kind of discussion with its like increasing availability and prevalence in youth?
Yeah, so pornography affects are pretty much universally, I would say, bad. Our brain, again, doesn't know the difference between watching someone doing it and participating in it. We have mirror neurons, so when we think about things or watch other people do something, we have neurons in our brains that fire and act as if we're doing it ourselves. And so we get that through pornography. And obviously I'm assuming the pornography, not just watching for the sake of it, although there's probably effects of that alone, but also with masturbation or orgasm, even if we're watching it with a partner, which I know has become a trend. We see pornography being more prevalent among women now, and so we're seeing more kind of sexual addiction among women today than we did 10 or 20, 30 years ago, largely because of pornography and just being so readily available. The number one thing, one of the top things you can do if you want to lose weight and diet is get rid of all the junk food from your house, right? You don't have that there as an option, you're not going to eat it. Well, what do we all have with us everywhere we go, right? With no one watching, complete privacy. Any one of you could get up right now and go sit in a stall in the bathroom, and if you really wanted to. And most people aren't at that level, but people with addiction and things like that, like, those are the kind of things they're doing. So it's a big temptation, more for some people than others. I don't know why, extremely luckily I watched pornography all the time because that was the hockey culture. Like, we would have it playing in the locker room before practices, like no big deal, and we'd laugh and joke about it, and we'd watch it together on bus rides, on road trips, and like it was all the time thing. But then when I became a Christian and thought about it, it's like, oh, this, like, there's no good from this. These people in these videos, like, even if we claim they're doing it of their own free will, right, which is debatable because a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are actually underage, sex trafficked, or they're in really bad positions or being forced to do it. But even if we say, right, they're doing it of their own free will, now they're going through all this issue with bonding and different partners and self-esteem, which people who've come out of the porn industry have attested to. But two, right, how many people, especially little girls growing up, wanted to be a porn star? Or dads wanted their kids to be porn stars. Like, it's not something people usually choose as a first career, right? It's usually because they're so wrapped into wanting to get an acting career, they're so desperate for money or whatever it might be, that's what they go into. So, yeah, it's had negative effects. They say there seems to be that, and I'm not at all suggesting porn or porn use, but just to give balance, like, because nothing is really universally bad. There's always some silver lining in everything, I would argue, or almost everything. Perhaps some positive effects of women watching porn. Again, possibly and likely because the whole either purity culture or kind of negative views. So being more comfortable with sex for them, because a lot of women tend to have negative views of sex because of how they were raised. So watching porn, at least some, may combat that. But again, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would recommend that being maybe more of, if that is something with you trying other methods, say reading novels or books or talking about that with your spouse or doing something like that in a therapeutic context, not just going out and doing it by yourself. Did you have a question too?
What you're in a conversation with somebody and you pull up a question, this conversation I had the other day, and you kind of pull up to them and say, hey, you know, our place, we don't allow girls in our bedrooms with the doors closed. That's just our house rule. The person asks why, and you say, well, it's kind of to not only guard our hearts, but it's to guard the girls' hearts, that, you know, whoever's over, we want to build this community. And trying to not say, oh, just because you're a Christian, trying to ease them into more rationale. What are some techniques used from this? Because this presentation had a lot of information on why, but this person that I was talking to kind of seemed to reject just the connotation or notion that's saying sex is bad even remotely.
Right.
And I know now, like, I can pull some things out just from this presentation, but how do you confront somebody that has had positive, like, you know, they've had maybe 1 or 2 boyfriends or something like that, or girlfriends, and it's been, you know, 90%, 100% positive, and they're saying, I think that's just stupid. I don't think that's accurate.
Right. Yeah, so let me have some conversation here with you for a second. Is that in like the context of a fraternity?
No, this was like just a friend who is not a Christian, and she just asked me why do I not have a girlfriend? So we were going through all these classes, like when
Okay, but in terms of the not having the door shut, is that you said at your home?
It's a house rule.
Okay.
If we're bringing a girlfriend or just a girlfriend over, just a personal like roommate house rule. Like, hey, there's nothing good that's going to come out of you closing the door with a girl in your bedroom.
Yeah, so one way to handle that, just as a broad way to avoid conversation, if you think it might be hostile, is to say, well, we don't want to deal with any issues of sexual assault or accusations of it, and so it's just safety thing in that terms. So has anyone here coached youth? Did they give you like I don't know if it was like for an official organization, but they probably give you like meetings like you should never be alone with a kid in a locker room or anything like that. So it's the same kind of idea, just to protect any false accusations or real accusations, like, right? You want to protect both sides no matter what might happen. So that's part of it. The other part would be, and people will give you pushback. Last time I gave this lecture, about a year ago actually, to another Ratio Christi club, there was a non-Christian there. He was there exploring, and he kept pushing back. He's like, I don't believe it. He's a physics major. He's a graduate student in physics. It's like, I don't accept it. You have to have sex before. You know it's not going to work. Like, it's just going to lead to better outcomes. I was like, yeah, but you're rejecting the evidence. And so it's hard to accept. Again, it's that emotional side. People don't want to necessarily accept it, especially if they've had positive experiences, but they're not looking kind of at the aggregate or how it typically affects people, or often people don't know how things affect people. There's all kinds of wonderful psychological studies about how things affect people, and then when they're asked, people are like, no, that didn't affect me. So for instance, one professor asked all the students to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, right? So they wrote this down, and then he had them bid, I think it was just a fake bid, on a bunch of different cheap items for a few bucks here and there, right? And then he looked at how much they bid for the items, and those who had higher numbers for their last 2 digits of social bid higher than those who didn't. It's a priming effect. We have this anchor, this idea in our mindset about how prices and things work. And so those who had that higher anchor bid higher. But then when they were asked if they had effect, every single one said, no, there's no way that affected the way I bid. But it did to a small degree. So it's a hard thing, tough thing to do. The best, I would say, would not to be, don't try to get into like an argument about it. Just have a conversation, ask, well, what do you actually believe? Why do you believe that? And not to try to corner them and trap them, but really find out. And then following along, well, do you think that aligns with the research, or do you think there's kind of scientific evidence, or how does maybe talking about it biologically? Are you aware of what happens in our brains biologically when we do have sex? Because a lot of people don't know. A lot of people say, yeah, I have an orgasm. It's great. It's like, well, there's hormones and neurotransmitters and things that release, and those affect us. And a lot of people just don't know. And so assuming that they're smart, but they may not know. And so having that conversation, kind of testing around, seeing if they're open to listen. If they're not really open to listen, they're just being argumentative, then just let them vent and be like, we're just trying to protect ourselves, and just keep it at that. Yes, Mitchell.
So-
Katie first. You talked
Yeah,
already.
go ahead.
I was going to ask a question, like, simply kind of for the Christian context, you kind of mentioned, like, the thing about when people having that infatuation stage and, like, it lasts, like, up to 2 years. Like, what about Christians, like, rushing into marriage because they're, like, still in that stage because they want to have sex? So, like, how would you,
Right.
like, I feel like that's a big culture thing.
Right, it is, yeah.
It's like a
Hear
huge
that
problem.
all the time. And
What would
I
you
go
say?
back and forth on that because that infatuation stage can last up to 2 years.
Yeah.
And if you get, let's say you've got a friend, you've been friends a couple years at college, 2 years, and then you decide to date for 6 months, and then get engaged, and then a year later you get married, that's within that 2 years, because when you start dating, it's different than your past. It's like it ramps it up, so you're going to go through that. And so then maybe you get through that infatuation stage after you got married, even though it's been a year and a half and you knew them for 2 years before that, right? So it still can happen.
But my question
Right.
kind of like, do you like just about the psychology part? Like, do you think that, I mean, like that's the kind of like love that's like clouding people's judgment? Do you think like it's better to like go to date longer? Would you like suggest that?
Right.
Or?
So generally, yeah, I would say the longer you date someone, the more you're likely to start to see them more clearly. And again, some people don't go through this infatuation stuff. It's going to be personal, person by person basis. But just little things like I slurp my soup. It makes drinking soup more enjoyable for me. Right? I like, especially when it's nice and hot. Like not so much when it's warm, but when it's hot, like I like a good slurp. My wife doesn't like it. Oftentimes, so little things like that, like you're dating, you've only been together for a little bit of time. Oh, whatever, I don't mind it, or oh, it's so cute, right? But then
Not so cute anymore.
after 6 months, a year, a couple years, it's like, can you please stop that now? And you don't know with anything, but the longer you do have, the more likely you're going to figure out how those things. So it's kind of a balance. I would say the thing to be careful is a lot of people will say, well, the Holy Spirit told me this is the one. And the Holy Spirit told several men that my wife was the one and they were going to get married shortly before Lindsay and I actually met. And like they said, like, I don't know you, but we need to get married. God told me. So you see a lot of that going on. So to be careful, it was a more charismatic type of church, but we don't want to fall in either trap. We don't want to wait 10 years and be like, all right, now I know. I'm ready.
Yeah.
So, yes, so just to not be opposed, we have this whole idea, follow our heart. And as apologists, we know not to do that in religion and other areas, but it doesn't apply necessarily to our relationships either. So we can have a rational view of our love life and think like, okay, well, we don't get along well, or we have these vastly different political beliefs or whatever, like that's probably going to create issues. And to talk about those things, and it's okay to do, because you still have, like, to be cognitive in a relationship is okay, and it doesn't detract from it as long as you still have that emotional connection. And so you can keep those both kind of growing together. And if you see warning signs, you can talk about those and work through them before it becomes an issue or before you get in too deep. But not to be scared to say, oh, well, I know we've been only dating 6 months, but there's these red flags, but I'm going to ignore them because I just feel so in love. Right? So to have that balance. And we can talk after.